When my husband found out that I couldn't inherit my father's inheritance.
What? You can't inherit his assets? If so, I have no use for you anymore. I want a divorce right now.
After that, I got my revenge on my husband and my sister, who got married to each other immediately. My name is Chloe, a 32-year-old office worker, and I've been married to my husband, George, for 2 years. I met George through a relative, and we got married. My family was somewhat wealthy, but since we were the only daughters, my relatives, worried about who would take over, introduced me to George, saying it would be okay for him to be married into our family. My husband, who married me, never married into the family, but he began living with me at my parents' home. My mother passed away a few years ago, and the 3 of us, my father, my husband, and I, live in my parents' house. My husband is very kind and treats my father well, so he seemed like a very good person. But a relative who introduced him to me told me something worrisome right before our marriage.
I know it's strange for me to say this since I was the one who introduced George to you, but he's kind of obsessed with money, so be careful.
I had already tied the knot with him and was about to have a wedding ceremony, so it was too late for me to do anything about it. But I hadn't noticed any money obsession from my husband, so I went ahead with the marriage. Even after getting married, I kept a close eye on my husband because of what I heard, but I didn't sense any obsession with money from him. However, he seemed to be curious about my father's assets, and he would casually ask about them when he was having a drink with my father. My father was open about it, so I didn't worry too much. Another thing my husband was curious about was my younger sister. My sister is 5 years younger than me, and unlike me, who is calm, she is lively and outgoing, with a vibrant social life with men. She doesn't look like me, and my husband was surprised when he first saw her.
Your sister has a completely different vibe from you, Chloe, doesn't she?
Seeing my husband, who was fascinated by my beautiful sister with her distinctive features, in stark contrast to my plain and boring self, gave me mixed feelings. However, the relative who introduced me was worried that if I, who's modest and plain-looking, couldn't get married, there would be no one to inherit after my family. I thought there was no need to worry because I had a beautiful sister, but I later realized why that relative was worried. My father was very lenient with my sister, allowing her to go to college after high school, and even to a vocational school after she graduated from college. It wasn't that my sister had a particular goal in mind when she went to college or to the vocational school. She just didn't want to work. On the contrary, my mother was strict with my sister, insisting she should get a job as soon as she graduated from college. But my father overruled my mother, allowing her to go to a vocational school. After graduating from the vocational school, my sister got a job at a company that a friend of my father's owned, but she quit after just 6 months. I was taken aback by my sister's excuse when she quit her job. I couldn't show my full potential at that company. My mother and I were baffled that she was talking as if she had already mastered all aspects of her job, despite only working for half a year. But my father seemed to believe my sister's story, and promptly arranged for her to start working at a different company. After a while at this new company, our mother got ill and had to be hospitalized. Once our mother was in the hospital, my sister was there every day, often skipping work. Eventually, she quit that job too, and started saying that she would take care of our mother. However, her version of caring was just being in the same room as our mother, chatting or spending most of her time staring at her smartphone in the waiting room. I was the one who had to pick up our mother's laundry from the hospital and replace it with fresh clothes while my sister wasn't being helpful at all. It's possible that our mother enjoyed having my sister there to talk to, but after about a month in the hospital, her condition worsened to the point that she couldn't even have a conversation. Within 2 weeks of her condition worsening, our mother passed away. My father and sister were in such a state of shock that they couldn't even arrange for a funeral, so I had to do it. Fortunately, our relatives were very helpful, and we were able to give our mother a proper send-off. After our mother's death, my sister started working part-time and moved out of my parents' house to live on her own. She couldn't pay her rent with just her part-time earnings, so our father started covering her rent and utility bills. It seemed like she was spending all the money she earned on her own for fun. Whenever her part-time income wasn't enough, she'd come to our father for money. Back when our mother was alive, she was strict with my sister, so even after my sister started working, our father didn't give her an allowance, but now he lets her have as much as she wants. I figured if both our father and sister were happy with the arrangement, there was no problem. Even after I got married and started living with my husband at my parents' house, my father continued to give my sister an allowance. At the time, I didn't notice, but it seems my sister was also asking my husband for money, and he was willingly giving it to her. He apparently couldn't say no to my beautiful sister and told her to keep it a secret from me, saying,
"Don't tell Chloe about this, okay? She might get jealous."
My sister used to do part-time work when she felt like it and was living on the money she received from our father and my husband. But such a lifestyle of hers couldn't last forever. It's because our father got ill and had to be hospitalized. I was visiting the hospital in between my work and taking care of our father, but my sister never even showed her face at the hospital. Instead, she started to call me and demand money. "Since I've been getting money from Dad every month, I need you to continue that. The rent and public utility bills are all being deducted from Dad's account after all." She spoke to me in an angry tone, and I was surprised by this fact that I heard for the first time. I got angry at my sister who, instead of worrying about our hospitalized father, was only concerned about her own life. Although I really wanted to hang up the phone, it seemed like my sister was also in trouble. So I asked her how much money our father was giving her every month. "How much are you getting from Dad every month? You need to get a job soon and start living on your own earnings." My sister responded in a grumpy tone. "Don't be so annoying. I was getting $1,000 every month. That's excluding the rent, by the way." I was stunned at my sister, who proudly stated the amount. I thought that if an adult like my sister was receiving so much money every month, she would lose any motivation to work seriously. I thought that our father would get better soon after being hospitalized, so I didn't think it was a big problem to give money to my sister. However, our father's condition suddenly worsened, and I quickly contacted our relatives. The doctor also told me that he was in a serious condition, and I was deeply shocked. I wanted to be supported by my husband at such a time, but he said he was busy with work and seldom came by the hospital. Moreover, even when my husband did come to the hospital, he would ask me insensitive questions like,
"Your father's inheritance must be huge, right? Since the only heirs are you two sisters, you're going to split it in half, right?"
I had no words to respond to my husband, who was only talking about the inheritance. At the same time as realizing that this is what my relatives meant, when they said my husband was obsessed with money, I also felt a sense of disgust. Even when I got a call from my sister and explained that our father was in a critical condition, she was only concerned about her own money. "Forget about that. Just make sure you pay me every month. Without that money, I can't live." The call ended right there. I was furious with what my sister said, but I was also concerned about the faint male voice I heard on the other side of the phone. I recognized that voice and had a bad feeling about it. About a month later, our father passed away, but neither my sister nor my husband were there at his last moment. Having experienced my mother's funeral, I realized that preparing for a funeral was a heavy task. To make matters worse, neither my husband nor my sister did anything to help. My sister didn't even attend the funeral. My husband showed up at the funeral, but as soon as it was over, he disappeared, saying he had work. Even the relative who introduced my husband to me noticed his absence and asked me about it. "What happened to your husband? It's strange for your husband to be absent, isn't it?" All I could do was give a bitter smile in response. It seems he's busy with work. He had to go home. Hearing my explanation, the relative sighed, but I was the one who also wanted to sigh. After my father's funeral was over and I was finally able to catch my breath, my husband came to me with a grin on his face.
"Finally, huh? How much did you inherit? Even if we split it in half, you're going to inherit quite a bit, right?"
As warned by my relative before we got married, it seemed that my husband's mind was full of thoughts about my father's inheritance. Disappointed in my husband, I responded nonchalantly. "My sister gets $100 million and I get 0. I hadn't yet discussed anything with my lawyer, and with the funeral just over, I hadn't even sorted out my feelings yet. Looking at my husband talking about the inheritance so happily, I felt like laughing out loud, beyond anger. My husband, believing my words, immediately began shouting.
"What? You can't inherit any of his assets? If so, I have no use for you anymore. Let's get a divorce right now."
Since I felt the same way, I replied back, "Let's do that. You married me for my father's inheritance in the first place, didn't you? I'll divorce you." As I shouted this, I thrust the divorce papers I had prepared at my husband. My husband seemed a little flustered as I brought out the divorce papers, as if I had anticipated this, but he signed them anyway. As my husband, who had signed the divorce papers, said this before he left.
"I'll divorce you, who has no inheritance, and remarry your sister Emily to get the $100 million.
Regardless, I immediately submitted the divorce papers. I was able to break up with my scumbag husband. My ex-husband seemed to have submitted the marriage certificate with my sister the next day. A few days later, I got a call from my ex-husband. Still believing that story, he yelled,
"When are you going to start the inheritance procedures? Give Emily the $100 million as soon as possible."
I was actually waiting for a call from my ex-husband. I didn't want to be the one to contact my ex-husband who left the house on his own. I answered my ex-husband in a businesslike tone. "Let's discuss it at my place this Sunday. I'll be ready for the process." My ex-husband, thinking he would receive the inheritance, was overjoyed and hung up the phone. But I was looking forward to seeing his face when he learned the actual truth. Over the weekend, my ex-husband and my sister came to my parents' house, and they were surprised that I had called a lawyer. However, my ex-husband spoke as if he was satisfied.
"I knew it! You need a lawyer when you inherit a fortune."
Then the lawyer spoke to my ex-husband with a puzzled look.
"There's the matter of inheritance, but before that, there's a matter of property of division claimed by your ex-wife against you."
And he began to show my ex-husband a few photos. They were photos of my ex-husband coming out of my sister's house with a date clearly written on it. The lawyer spoke to my ex-husband.
These are photos of evidence of your affair before the divorce was finalized. You will have to abide by the property of division."
I had heard my ex-husband talking about the inheritance over the phone with my sister, and immediately asked my lawyer to investigate about my husband's infidelity. Perhaps because they thought I was distracted by my father's funeral, my ex-husband and sister were meeting at my sister's house almost every day, which allowed me to obtain a lot of evidence. Both my ex-husband and sister were stunned when the topic switched from inheritance to their infidelity. But my ex-husband quickly regained his composure and argued back.
"Property division is a small thing compared to the $100 million inheritance. I'll pay it off right away."
When the lawyer presented the documents in front of my ex-husband, who was speaking arrogantly, he signed it easily. After confirming that, I told my ex-husband, "Enjoy your life with my sister, who inherited nothing. Since you signed, I'll make sure to collect the property division." The moment she heard that she inherited nothing, my sister screamed, "What? Why is my inheritance 0? I'm supposed to get $100 million. My ex-husband also turned red and started yelling,
"There's no way there's no inheritance, right? I won't let you take it all by yourself."
The lawyer calmly started to explain to the two of them, who were angry.
"Emily is actually her late mother's child from her previous relationship, and she was not officially adopted by Chloe's late father, so there is no legal parent-child relationship between Chloe's father and Emily. Therefore, Emily, you cannot inherit your father's estate."
I also explained to my sister, who seemed confused. "When our parents remarried, Emily, you were about 1 year old. So I don't think you remember, but I remember it clearly. When our parents remarried, I was 6 years old, and I clearly remember how happy I was to suddenly have a sister. I never expected such a sister would steal my husband." Our father and mother, both burdened with young children, seemed to think it was best to balance out well between the children when they remarried and started parenting. My mother loved me as if I were her own daughter, and my father treasured my sister. Maybe my father spoiled my sister more because she wasn't his biological daughter and he was overly cautious. Though both of them remarried with children, my mother, who was suspected by relatives of being interested in my father's assets, refused to adopt my sister. The relatives who kept recommending me for marriage did so because they knew that I was the only one who could inherit my father's wealth. If there had been a child between my father and my mother, things might have gotten even more complicated, but fortunately or unfortunately, they had no children. Perhaps they didn't have children in order to avoid disputes over inheritance in the future. Now I understand that since he couldn't leave his inheritance to my sister, my father had been financially supporting her even after she became an adult. Just like my sister, I wasn't officially adopted by my mother, so legally we weren't parent and child, but we never cared about that ever. It seems that our parents hadn't told my sister that they were both actually remarried, and today was the first time she learned the truth. I wonder if my ex-husband understood the situation immediately, his face turning from red to pale. In addition to not getting the inheritance he was expecting from my sister, he was also being asked for property division, and he had already signed the documents. With a pale face, my ex-husband asked me,
"Was the $100 million for my sister and 0 for me, you said, a lie?"
Suppressing my laughter, I answered, "Of course it's a lie. It was to get back at you for having an affair behind my back. And there's no way my father's inheritance was $100 million. My father, although he was wealthy, didn't have an inheritance of $100 million. Suddenly, my quiet sister screamed, "I've done quite a lot of shopping, expecting that I would get Dad's inheritance. What's going to happen to the money that Dad had been paying until now? Will you pay for me, sis?" "Since you're married and have a reliable husband, you don't need it anymore, right? Have George support you. My sister was looking at my ex-husband, who was pale, but my ex-husband shook his head.
I can't afford that. I also bought a lot of things expecting the inheritance, and now there's property division, so I'm at my limit.
After saying that, my husband suddenly got on his knees before me and started to apologize.
Chloe, I'm sorry, it was my fault. I apologize, so can we get back together?
The lawyer, who had been packing up to go home, laughed at the scene. Where did the arrogant attitude he had when he arrived at the house go to? George pleading on his knees like that was completely ridiculous. After the discussion, my ex-husband and sister left, depressingly, and seemed to have divorced soon after. For my ex-husband, who remarried with the intention of inheriting my sister's inheritance, he seems to have lost interest in my sister, who didn't receive any inheritance. As he was saying, there's going to be property division and he can't take care of my sister. But since my ex-husband has no property whatsoever, I decided to have him pay for it from his monthly salary. My lawyer advised me that this way I wouldn't miss out on receiving it. My sister, who lost my father, who had been supporting her, seemed to be working part-time every day out of necessity, but it seems that she couldn't afford to pay off her debts and ended up filing for bankruptcy. After that, she moved out of the apartment where she lived, and I don't know where she went. My father was financially supporting my sister, thinking of her, but because of him spoiling her, my sister became unable to work in a serious way. Later, my relatives started talking about introducing me to a marriage partner as I began living alone in my parents' house, but I refused. I wouldn't want to be introduced to a man like my ex-husband again. So this time, I want to find a marriage partner by myself.